"You won't survive," the alien princess said, unaware he was death itself. The docking bay held 300 beings, and not one of them breathed when the airlock opened. I walked out alone. No ceremony, no escort, no weapons display, no fleet formation, no pre-recorded diplomatic overture playing on a speaker that cost more than a small colony. Just me, a gray uniform that had been washed too many times, and the kind of quiet that follows a man who has spent enough years in rooms where the wrong word ends everything. The Hegemony Conclave's central bay was the size of a city block, carved from a mineral that caught light and threw it back in colors that had no names in any Earth language I knew. The ceiling curved 200 feet overhead. The floor hummed at a frequency designed to make visitors feel small. 6 species stood in arranged clusters, each positioned at a precise distance from the central dais, their rank sigils blazing with bioluminescent color, so layered and complex that looking at them too long felt like staring into a fire. I looked at my watch instead. It was cracked, had been cracked for 11 years. I had never replaced the glass. I checked the time the way a man checks the time when he already knows exactly what time it is and just wants something to do with his hands so the room doesn't think he's nervous. I wasn't nervous. The Theresi representative, 7 feet of crystalline exoskeleton, 6 limbs folded like the wings of something that had forgotten how to fly, stepped forward first. It recited its lineage in a frequency that hit the chest more than the ears. 42,000 years of unbroken dominion. 14 species folded into the hegemony during its tenure, 3 wars won before the other side had finished declaring them. The translator in my ear kept up without straining. The Velxorn representative unfurled next. 4 wings, compound eyes that caught every angle of the room at once, and a pheromone release that knocked 2 junior officials sideways before the ventilation system caught it. Pure dominance. Old species confidence. The kind that didn't need to be angry, because it had stopped needing to prove anything several thousand years ago. They all looked at me. The translator crackled. Protocol demanded a species introduction, lineage, conquest history, biological threat classification, which was apparently a real category that real civilizations used when meeting each other for the first time. I tapped the pen against the yellow legal pad I was holding. Ezra Voss, I said. Earth. The translator caught up with a slight delay. 300 beings waited for more. We've been around a while, I said. The Theresi Archon, the one running this event, the one with the most sigils blazing on its thorax, leaned forward exactly 1 centimeter. For a Theresi, that was practically a collapse. How long, the translator rendered. Is a while? I clicked the pen. Long enough. That was the moment. Not a shot. Not a threat. Just 2 words landing in a room full of beings who had built their entire civilization on the precise measurement of time, and found, for the first time in 42,000 years, a number they couldn't place. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one when I'd walked in. The first one had been surprise. This one was the beginning of something else. I didn't name it. I didn't need to. I'd felt it before, in smaller rooms, on a smaller planet, in situations where the exit was just a shape on the wall and not something you were actually going to use. I wrote something on the legal pad. Not because I needed notes. Because a man who writes things down in a room full of beings with perfect neural recall is either a fool or a statement, and I had not come 42,000 light years to be a fool. She came in late. Of course she did. The protocol manuals. I had read all of them, all 700 pages, during the 14-day fold transit, because I read the things other people skip, and that habit had kept me breathing on 6 different occasions I could name, and probably 3 I couldn't. The protocol manuals specified that the highest ranked entered last. The weight of an entrance depended on the length of the absence before it. I heard the door before I saw her. Not a sound, exactly. More like a pressure shift. The way a room changes when the most important thing in it walks in, and every other important thing recalibrates. Princess Sarava of the Velthari. My brain did something it had not done in 11 years. It went quiet. Not blank, just quiet. The way a very loud room goes quiet when the music stops and you suddenly hear the air. She was tall in the way a blade is tall. Not decorative, not ceremonial. Every proportion a decision made by something that had been thinking about efficiency for a very long time. Her skin caught the light in a way that didn't match any angle she was standing at, which meant it wasn't catching the light at all. It was making its own, in the thin, iridescent layer beneath the surface, cool and controlled, and utterly uninterested in being beautiful, even though beauty was the inevitable result. She looked at me the way a person looks at an equation they've already solved and found uninteresting. "You are the human envoy," she said through the translator. It wasn't a question, it was a category. "Last time I checked," I said. Her head tilted, maybe 3 degrees, the Velthari equivalent of raising an eyebrow, according to the cultural briefing I had read on day 2 of the transit. "Your species has no threat classification in our archives." I clicked the pen twice. "That's one way to look at it," I said. Her eyes, deep amber, entirely too focused for a first meeting, held on mine for exactly 2 seconds longer than protocol required. Then she moved to her position in the room, her rank sigils burning low and controlled against all that borrowed light, and I went back to my legal pad, and I wrote down the thing I had been thinking since the moment I walked into this bay, and counted the beings and calculated the exits, and noticed, with the part of my brain that never fully turned off, that the room had exactly 3 sight lines covering the door I'd come in through. They were good, but they'd positioned those sight lines for a species that walked in afraid. I wrote that down. Then I underlined it. The reception after the formal session was held in a hall where the walls were made of compressed starlight. I mean that literally. The hegemony had a process. I had read about it. I did not fully understand it. I understood enough to know it was expensive, and the expense was the point. I stood at the observation window and watched the actual stars outside, which were free, and which I had always preferred. She found me there. I heard her before I saw her. The same pressure shift as before, and I didn't turn around because turning around would have meant she'd surprised me, and she hadn't. "You are not afraid," she said. It was the first thing she said that wasn't a category or a protocol. It was an observation delivered with something adjacent to confusion, which told me she was paying closer attention than she was showing. "Should I be?" I said. "Every species that has stood where you stood today has been afraid, even the ones that fought. Especially the ones that fought." 2 seconds of silence, the recalibration kind. "You came here with 1 ship," she said. "No fleet, no allied species, no resource leverage we have been able to identify, no threat classification." She paused. "Either you are operating on a level of miscalculation our systems cannot measure. Or," I said. She looked at me the way you look at a door when you have just realized the lock might be on the other side. "Or you believe you need none of those things." I turned from the window then, looked at her, the amber eyes, the controlled light beneath her skin, the 3 degrees of tilt that meant she was working something out, and not done working it out. "Your conclave has been running 42,000 years, I said. "You know what you haven't done in 42,000 years? She waited. "Lost," I said. "Yes. That's the thing about a perfect record." I tucked the legal pad under my arm. "It's real fragile." She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away either, and I counted that as the most honest thing anyone in this building had said to me all day. I was almost at the corridor door when she spoke. "You won't survive the month, Commander Voss." I stopped. "The Conclave has already decided. You are an unclassified variable in a system that does not tolerate unclassified variables." Her voice was level, factual, the way a meteorologist is factual when they tell you there's a storm coming. "This is not a threat, it is simply the outcome." I turned back. She was standing exactly where she'd been, still, like something that had grown accustomed to being the most permanent object in any room it entered. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I smiled. It was, I knew, the wrong kind of smile for the situation. Not cruel, not challenging, just the specific smile of a man who has been handed a death sentence and heard, in the words, something the person handing it hadn't intended to say. "Princess," I said. "Yes. I've been an unclassified variable my whole life." I walked out. The corridor was cold, and the lights were the color of a shallow sea, and somewhere behind me, in that compressed starlight hall, a princess of the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy stood in a doorway, and felt, for the first time she could clearly remember, like she was the one being watched. She would tell me this later. She would not be pleased about it. I would write it down. I had been awake for 19 hours when they came for me. Not because I couldn't sleep, because I had learned, in rooms far less comfortable than my quarters aboard the Persistence, that the night after a first meeting was when the other side made up their mind about what kind of problem you were, and the answer to that question always arrived before morning, one way or another. The 3 Theresi infiltrators were good, credit where it was due. The exoskeletal frame gave them near silence on hard floors, each footfall distributed across 6 limb points, weight shifting so gradually that the sound sensors I'd placed at the airlock registered nothing until they were already inside the first corridor junction. But good and good enough are 2 different things. I was sitting in the dark when the first one came through the inner door. I had been sitting in the same chair for 4 hours. Not because I'd known it would be tonight, specifically, because it was always going to be one of the first 3 nights, and sitting in a chair in the dark was something I had gotten very comfortable with a long time ago, in places I did not think about before situations that were going to require my hands. What happened next took 11 seconds. I know because I counted. The first one came in high, targeting the bed. Good call. Beds are where you expect a person to be at this hour, and you commit to the angle because hesitation costs you the element. The second one split left, toward the door to the cockpit corridor, which was tactically correct. You seal the escape route first, then you close the box. The third one went for the pilot's quarters directly. I had to respect that. I had taught a class on exactly that move, once. Different room, different planet. The instructor evaluations had said I was thorough. 11 seconds. 3 Theresi. No permanent damage, which was a choice, not a limitation. I sat with them zip-tied to the ventilation rack for about 20 minutes while I made a decision about what to say. I could send them back empty-handed, which was a statement about my confidence. I could send them back with a message, which was a negotiation. I pulled a yellow post-it note from the pad, wrote 1 word in Velthari script. I had learned the written language during the transit, working from an archived linguistics file that the hegemony apparently considered too old to bother encrypting. The script was clean and geometric and honest in the way that very old languages sometimes are, before a civilization decides that complexity is a form of power. The word was unclassified. I stuck it to the lead infiltrator's collar. Cut them loose. Watch them go. Then I sat back down in the dark and waited for morning, because morning was when things got interesting, and I had not come all this way to miss interesting. Princess Sarava went to the primary archive at the edge of the 3rd day. I know this because the Persistence's passive signal array picked up the archive's authentication handshake, a specific frequency burst that the hegemony used to verify high-clearance access, and which I had cataloged during the transit, alongside approximately 400 other things that the hegemony had decided were too routine to encrypt. I know what she found because I had already found it. The gaps. Sections of stellar cartography spanning a 400 light-year radius around Earth's galactic neighborhood where civilizations had existed at various points across 200,000 years of recorded hegemony history, and then had not existed. Not absorbed, not conquered, not starved out by a dying star, or consumed by a known predator species. Gone. Completely. Tidally. In time frames that ranged from a single generation to 3. The hegemony archivists had flagged these sections as anomalous 17 times, across 40,000 years of record-keeping, and had, each time, attributed them to data corruption in the original surveys. It was the kind of explanation that worked if you never looked at all the anomalies at the same time. Sarava looked at all of them at the same time. I knew she was done with the archive when the authentication frequency went quiet, and stayed quiet for 40 minutes. Which was exactly how long it takes a very intelligent person to do the same math 3 times and arrive at the same answer and sit with it. She came to my ship. My ship. Not the diplomatic suite the hegemony had assigned me. Not the formal meeting hall. She sent a direct comm request on a frequency that wasn't listed in the official channel guide, which meant she'd found it by looking, and she came herself, without her protocol staff, which in Velthari culture was the equivalent of showing up at someone's door with your shoes off. I made coffee. She stood in the galley doorway and watched me fill the press and pour the water, and wait the 4 minutes with the focused patience of someone who had decided to be patient on purpose. "You've been in the archive," I said. "How did you know?" "You have that look." "What look?" she said. "The one where the math came out wrong, and you've already checked it twice." She sat down across from me without being invited. I counted that as progress. For a while she just watched the coffee, the color of it, the way the heat moved through it. "The gaps in the stellar cartography," she said. The civilizations that disappeared. Before the hegemonies recorded contact with your region. Did humanity." She stopped. She was a precise speaker. She did not stop often. "Were those events connected to your species?" I looked at her over the rim of the mug. The amber eyes, the controlled light, the 3-degree tilt that was happening now without her seeming to notice, which meant whatever she was working out was consuming processing power she usually allocated to self-presentation. "What?" One beat of silence. The specific beat that exists between a question and an answer that cannot be taken back. "Hungry," I said. She did not move. I drank my coffee. Outside the porthole, Hegemony Prime turned slowly in its orbit, vast and bioluminescent, and utterly unaware that it had just heard the most important words spoken to any of its inhabitants in 42,000 years, in a galley that smelled like earth roast and recycled ship air, from a man with a cracked watch and a legal pad, and the specific kind of stillness that you only find in things that have already decided what they are. She did not ask me to explain. She was smart enough to know that explaining was not the point. The gap was the point. The gap between what the archive said humanity was, a young, newly spacefaring species, no threat classification, no conquest history, no record, and what the gaps in the stellar cartography, when laid against the timeline of Earth's actual geological and biological record, implied. She sat with that gap the way you sit with a very deep hole you have just discovered, in what you thought was solid ground. She didn't speak for 6 minutes. Then she wrapped both hands around the coffee mug she wasn't drinking and said, very quietly, in the Velthari phrasing that her translator rendered as a kind of careful understatement, "I need to think." "Take your time," I said. She left without the 3 protocol staff she'd arrived without. I refilled my mug, wrote 3 words on the legal pad, then crossed one out, then wrote it again differently, then closed the pad and went to look at the stars through the porthole. The stars out here were the same stars, different angle, different density, different arrangement, but the same light, traveling the same speed, indifferent to what it passed through on the way. I had always found that comforting. There was a weapons test on the 4th day. The hegemony's military liaison, a Velksorn officer named something that came through the translator as a 3-toned chord, extended the invitation with the careful neutrality of someone doing something for 2 reasons and only acknowledging one of them. The official reason, standard tour for new diplomatic contacts. The real reason, every species that had ever sat in the observation gallery of a hegemony weapons test had walked out different, quieter, more cooperative. The kind of cooperative that starts when you watch something you cannot compete with perform without effort. Sareva was there. She hadn't told me she would be. She stood 2 seats away in the observation gallery, looking at the display array, and when I sat down, she did not look at me, which meant she had known I would sit there. The target was a moon, airless, unpopulated. The hegemony's files on it were 3 lines long. It had been selected, I suspected, because its size was easily recognizable, and its destruction would produce a visual effect that scaled well in an observation gallery. The weapon system charged for 40 seconds. The moon was there. 4.3 seconds later it was not. No explosion. Exactly. More like the concept of the moon was revised. The mass converted, dispersed, the light of it folding into frequencies that the gallery windows filtered before they hit the eye. Clean, total, efficient. The military aide next to the liaison made a note. Every visiting species' reaction to this moment was catalogued and classified. I wrote something on the legal pad. "That is our most precise weapons system," the liaison said through the translator. The tone was designed to sound like it wasn't a boast. It was a boast. "That's a large footprint," I said. The translator caught up. The liaison processed the response. Large, it repeated. Footprint, I confirmed. It destroyed the target completely. Yes, without collateral dispersal beyond the projected radius. I tapped the pen. We used to do it quieter. The aide stopped writing. Sarava turned and looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down. Quieter, she said. When you don't want them to see it coming, I said. I looked at where the moon had been, the empty coordinate, the space it had occupied, still vibrating faintly in the long-wave frequencies. That's not mercy. That's just craft. The aide made a different kind of note. The liaison said nothing. Sarava watched me for a long moment with the amber eyes and the completely controlled expression that had, very slightly, somewhere around the lower third of her face, stopped being entirely controlled. I kept looking at the empty coordinate. Craft, I had said. The word sat in the observation gallery, like a piece of furniture nobody knew what to do with. On the 5th night, she found me on the Persistence's upper deck, the one with the wide-angle viewport that curved enough to give you a full hemisphere of stars if you stood in the right place. She stood in the right place. We stood there together for a while without talking, which was not something the Velthari did casually. Silence in their culture was either ceremony or intimacy, and this was not ceremony. "You could have left by now," she said eventually. Could have. The conclave's decision is recorded. You are, by any standard we apply to these situations, a target with an expiration already set. She looked at the stars. Why are you still here? Because the decision can be unmade. The Archon does not unmake decisions. Not talking about the Archon. She turned. I was already looking at her. Not the way you look at a target. Not the way you look at a problem. The older, simpler way. The way that has no tactical component and no exit strategy, and that I had not used in longer than I cared to count, because it required the kind of stillness that was different from combat stillness. It required not being ready for anything to go wrong. "You came here to change our minds," she said. "Came here to give you a choice. Between what?" I looked back at the stars. "Between being the 42,000th year hegemony," I said. The pause that followed was the length of a breath held and released. "And," she said, "being the civilization that survives long enough to find out what comes after." She did not answer. She did not leave. The stars did what they always do. Burned without knowing they were burning. Sent their light in every direction without caring where it landed. I stayed at the viewport for a long time after she eventually went, and I looked at the specific cluster of stars that included, from this angle and distance, the tiny yellow one that Earth orbited, and I thought about the 14-day transit, and the yellow legal pad, and the cracked watch, and all the things I had not said in that observation gallery, or in the galley with the coffee, or in the compressed starlight hall on the first night. All the things I carried the way you carry something so long it stops feeling like weight and starts feeling like structure. The next morning, the Archon moved. The message came through on the ship's official diplomatic channel at 0600, which meant it had been composed and approved and run through 3 levels of hegemony legal review before it was sent, which meant the decision had been made the night before, probably around the time I was standing at the viewport with Sarava, and choosing, for a few hours, not to be what I was. The text was formal. The hegemony's formal communications had a specific rhythm, long clauses with the conclusion buried at the end, the way you bury a knife in a handshake. I had read enough of them during the transit that I could find the point without reading the setup. The point: 17 hegemony warships were folding into the system. The Persistence was to stand down, power its full drive offline, and await official escort to a processing station. Commander Voss was granted a window of 60 minutes to disembark to the station personally, in which case his safety was guaranteed under hegemony diplomatic protocol, a document that was 42,000 years old and had, in that time, guaranteed the safety of exactly no species that had needed it to. I read it once. Set it down. Picked up the legal pad, flipped to a clean page, and wrote for about 30 seconds. Careful. Longhand. The way I wrote everything, not because I couldn't type faster, but because the hand moving across the page forced a kind of thinking that the brain skipped when the fingers went faster than it. Then I opened the ship channel. "All crew," I said. "This is the commander. You have 10 minutes to disembark to the station docking bay. Take the secondary airlock. Leave everything where it is. Silence on the line. Then Lieutenant Owen Carr, my first officer, who had been with me for 4 years, and who had stopped asking certain questions approximately 3.5 years ago. Sir. That's an order, Lieutenant. Another silence, shorter this time. Yes, sir. I clicked off. Then I sat in the command chair and listened to the ship breathe. The ventilation, the reactor hum, the subtle groan of the hull doing what hulls do in the thermal differential between a planet's shadow and its light. And I thought about the legal pad, and the cracked watch, and the word hungry, and the gaps in a 42,000-year archive that nobody had ever looked at all at once before. I thought about Sarava, standing at my viewport looking at stars she'd seen 1,000 times, as if they were showing her something new. I opened the ship's deepest system. Not the weapons array, not the shields, not the fold drive. The thing that had been built into the Persistence's hull at a construction depth that the Hegemony's scan teams had catalogued on arrival as inert structural reinforcement, because their scan frequencies could not reach the layer it operated at, and because nothing in their 42,000 years of encounter had required them to develop a scan frequency that could. The ship woke up. Not loudly, not with light shows or energy discharge or any of the theatrics that the Hegemony weapons demonstration had deployed for an audience. Quietly, the way very old things wake up when something specific calls to them. The signal went out. One frequency, omnidirectional, a pulse that lasted 0.8 seconds and contained, in a compression format that had been developed long before the Hegemony existed, a single instruction in a language that only a very specific kind of receiver was built to understand. I am here. I sat back in the command chair. I waited. The answer came in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. On the Hegemony's long-range array, I could see their reaction through the passive signal system. 17 objects materialized at the outer edge of the system. Not in a formation that the Hegemony's tactical catalog recognized. Not in any shape that corresponded to a known vessel class, a known propulsion signature, a known energy profile. The Hegemony's scan systems began filing error reports, not because the objects weren't there, but because the available categories were insufficient to describe what was there. The objects were simply waiting. 17 points of stillness at the edge of the system, in the dark between stars, as patient as something that has never needed to be in a hurry, because hurry implies a timeline you might run out of. In the Archon's chamber, I imagined, things were happening fast. In my command chair, I keyed the diplomatic channel. Archon, I said. The channel connected in under 2 seconds, which told me the Archon had been waiting at it. Commander Voss, the translation system rendered, with a frequency underpinning that the cultural briefing described as the Theresi equivalent of maintaining composure under conditions where composure was no longer instinctive. I'm going to say something, I said. I want you to hear it the way it's meant. Not a threat. I am very tired of threats. This is a fact, offered between adults who would both prefer to still be having this conversation in a month. Silence. We have been waiting, I said, a very long time for somebody worth talking to. The signal from the 17 objects at the edge of the system pulsed once, a response to the broadcast, a confirmation, a presence asserting itself without aggression, the way something very large can be entirely still and still be felt by everything around it. Don't make me stop waiting, I said. I set down the comm unit, picked up the pen, wrote one word on the legal pad, underlined it, closed it, and waited for the Archon to decide what kind of civilization it wanted to be. In her private chamber, Sarava was already moving. She had left my viewport hours before and gone to her rooms and sat in the dark the way I sat in the dark, not for lack of light, but for the specific quality of thinking that darkness allows, the kind where the shapes you're working with are only in the mind, and so the mind can be honest about them. She had done the math again. Not the archive math. She was past that. She had done a different math, the one that starts with a single question. What does it mean that he came here alone? Not strategically alone, not politically alone. Alone in the way that requires a specific kind of certainty. The kind that doesn't come from ignorance of the risk. The kind that comes from a thorough and complete understanding of the risk and a decision, made somewhere quiet and private, that the risk was acceptable. He had come alone because he had something better than a fleet. He had come alone because he was the fleet. No, that wasn't quite it either. She pressed her hands flat against the surface of her desk and breathed through the translation her mind was attempting, and arrived, finally, at the formulation that fit. He had come alone because a fleet was a statement of power, and he had not come to make a statement. He had come to make an offer. She stood up and went to find the Archon. The Archon's formal chamber was at the center of the conclave complex, shielded by 6 levels of access verification, surrounded by the 12 oldest serving members of the Hegemony's governing council, lit by the same compressed starlight technology as the reception hall but older, the original installation, the light slightly different in quality, less perfect, more real. She walked through all 6 access levels without slowing. The guards at each checkpoint knew her face and her rank sigils and the specific frequency of her biometric scan, but she thought it was also possible that the walk she was doing, the one where the decision was already made and the body was simply carrying it forward, communicated something that bypassed the checkpoint protocols entirely. The Archon looked up when she entered. The council looked up. She set the archive files on the central table, the ones she had pulled from the primary archive on the 3rd day, the gap maps, the date correlations, the math she had done 3 times. He came here as a gesture of restraint, she said. Princess Sarava, the council has determined. You are about to teach them what happens when humans stop restraining themselves. The Archon was quiet. The council was quiet. The compressed starlight did what it always did, which was to make everything in the room look slightly more important than it actually was. Except right now, everything in the room actually was important, so the effect was accurate for once. Our threat classification system operates on observable data, she said. Conquest history, fleet capability, biological aggression metrics, resource acquisition behavior. She tapped the archive files. We classify what we can see. We have always assumed that what we cannot see is what does not exist. She looked at the Archon. We have never before encountered a species that chose not to show us what it was. The objects at the edge of the system, the Archon began, are waiting for one man's decision, she said. And that man sent his crew off his ship and sat alone in a command chair and called you on the diplomatic channel. She let that sit. He did not launch anything. He did not threaten anything. He gave you information, and he asked you to think about it. He issued an ultimatum. He made a statement of fact, she said. There is a difference. You know there is a difference. You have issued enough of both to know the sound of each. The Archon's 4 eyes moved in the slow, sequential pattern that in Theresi physiology indicated deep processing, the kind that happened when the input did not match the available frameworks and the frameworks needed to be revised. If we stand down, the Archon said, we accept a renegotiation of the terms we presented to the human envoy. Yes. The council will require, she said, to be alive long enough to require things. And right now, that depends entirely on what you do in the next 10 minutes. She was not angry when she said it. That was important. She had been angry for about 4 hours the previous night, when she had first understood the full shape of what Ezra Voss had walked into this building carrying. The anger had been clean and brief, and she had let it finish without performing it. What she felt now was something else, something that did not have a Velthari word. She suspected, examining it from the side, that it was a word from a much older language. The Archon stood down the fleet. The order took 6 minutes to compose, approve, and transmit to the 17 warships holding formation around the Persistence. 6 minutes during which the 17 objects at the edge of the system held their positions without variation, patient as bedrock, patient as something that had been waiting so long that waiting had become its natural state. When the warships pulled back, the objects did not move. They were still there when the renegotiation began, still there when the council sat down across a different table from the one they had prepared, a round one, because Sarava had specified round, and nobody had argued with her about it. Still there, presumably, when the session ran 12 hours and produced a document that used words like mutual recognition and resource exchange and bilateral survey rights that were so far from integration and labor classification that they might as well have been written by a different civilization entirely. Which, in a way, they were. The Archon signed it. I signed it. I signed it with a pen from the legal pad portfolio, the same one I had been writing with since I arrived, and the Archon looked at the pen with 3 of its 4 eyes, and the look was the specific look of something encountering an irrelevant detail that is somehow, inexplicably, the most clarifying thing it has seen all day. I capped the pen, closed the pad, put it under my arm, walked out. The docking bay was quiet when I got there. My crew was already aboard, Owen Carr doing the pre-departure sequence with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent the last 12 hours not asking questions and was preparing to continue not asking them. I was almost at the ramp when I heard her footsteps. I knew them by now. 3 days and I knew them. The specific cadence of someone who covered ground without the ground noticing. She stopped where she had stopped on the first day, the same position, like she was aware of the symmetry and had chosen it on purpose, which she had, because everything she did was on purpose. "You could have done that on the first day," she said. "Yes. The signal. The objects at the edge of the system. You could have arrived with them instead of alone." "Yes. Why didn't you?" I stopped, turned and looked at her. The amber eyes, the light beneath her skin that she still wasn't performing for me, which meant she'd stopped performing it a couple of days ago without either of us naming the moment it stopped. "Because I wanted to see if you would figure it out yourself," I said. She absorbed that. "You were testing us," she said. "Giving you room. Different thing." Room for what? I looked down at the cracked watch. The glass had gone on a deployment so long ago that I had stopped thinking of it as broken and started thinking of it as accurate. A record of a specific moment, carried forward. Not sentiment, not carelessness. A reminder. Room to be the thing that chooses, I said, instead of the thing that gets chosen for. She looked at the watch, at the crack. "You've never replaced the glass," she said. "No? Why?" I closed the portfolio, looked at the stars through the bay's open exterior shield, the real stars, the free ones, the same from any angle. "Because some cracks are the record," I said, "not the damage." I went up the ramp. At the top I paused, not for effect, because there was one thing left and it needed the right distance to land correctly. "Princess," I said. "Yes. You said I wouldn't survive the month." She was quiet for a beat. One precise beat. "Yes," she said. "I did." I almost smiled. The same wrong smile as the first night. Almost. Not quite. This one had something in it that the first one hadn't. A small difference that I did not name and she did not ask about. And that was correct, because some things are not smaller for being unnamed. "Appreciate the concern," I said. The ramp closed. The persistence lifted. She stood in the docking bay and watched the ship rise through the atmospheric field and into the dark above Hegemony Prime, and she kept watching until the fold drive engaged and the ship was there and then was not. The way something is present until the moment it chooses not to be, leaving nothing in its place, except the specific quality of a space that had recently been occupied by something significant. The 17 objects at the edge of the system were gone too. When the Hegemony's long-range array checked the coordinates again, there was nothing there but stars. No energy signature, no residual propulsion trace, no evidence that anything had ever been at those coordinates, except the scan logs from the previous hours. And the scan logs from the previous hours showed readings that the archive classification system would spend the next 3 years attempting to categorize, and ultimately would not. The Archon reviewed the scan logs once, then filed them under a new category. A category that had not existed in the Hegemony archive for 42,000 years of continuous record-keeping. The category was simply unknown. Not a failure of data, not a corruption in the survey, not an anomaly to be resolved when better instruments were available. Unknown, as a permanent designation, as a category that the Hegemony, for the first time in its history, was willing to maintain without resolution. Because some things are larger than the frameworks available to contain them, and the correct response to something larger than your frameworks is not to force it into the closest available category, it is to build a new one. Sarava wrote the policy amendment herself, the one that created the category, the one that changed the archive classification system from a closed taxonomy to an open one, capable of receiving new entries, capable of admitting that what was known was a fraction of what existed, and that the fraction had, as of this week, become a slightly smaller percentage of the whole. She wrote it in the Velthari Academic Register, precise and clean and formally correct, and at the end of it she wrote one line that was not in the academic register, that would later be flagged by the Council's editorial review as tonally inconsistent with the rest of the document, and that she refused to remove. The line was, "Some records are not the damage." The Council left it in. The archive updated. The stars went on burning. Far out in the dark between systems, moving at fold speed through a geometry that human engineers had spent 200 years perfecting and had never fully explained to anyone else, a man with a cracked watch and a yellow legal pad sat in a command chair and listened to his ship breathe. Owen Carr came in with 2 cups of ship coffee, set one on the console, said nothing. I picked it up, drank it, wrote one line on the legal pad. They chose, closed it, looked at the stars through the forward port, the same stars, different angle, same light, the same indifferent burning that had been going on since long before anything alive had existed to watch it, and would go on long after the last thing alive had stopped. Beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they have been doing what they are, without apology or performance since before the word beautiful existed to describe them. I finished the coffee, put down the mug, picked up the pen, wrote 3 more words. Worth the trip, closed the pad, went to sleep. For the first time in 11 years, I slept 6 consecutive hours. I know because Owen Carr told me later, with the specific careful tone of someone reporting data that surprises them more than they want to show. I did not tell him why. Some records are not the damage. Some things you carry until carrying them stops being the weight and starts being the proof. Proof that you were there. Proof that you chose. Proof that the choosing was possible. The stars burned. The ship moved. The galaxy, vast and ancient and full of things that had not yet decided what they were, continued in its long rotation around a center that no species had ever reached, and every species had ever used as a reference point, turning the way everything turns that is large enough, and old enough, and patient enough to have stopped noticing that it is moving at all. Somewhere behind us, on a planet lit by compressed starlight and the bioluminescent rank sigils of 6 civilizations, trying to decide what 42,000 years meant in light of a new 42,001st, a princess sat at a desk with the archive open on one screen and a blank document open on another, and she sat with the blank document for a long time before she wrote the first word. She told me later she had written 17 beginnings and deleted them. She told me the 18th one stayed. She never told me what it said. I never asked. Some things are not smaller for being unnamed. The persistence folded on. The stars burned on. The math, patient and indifferent and accurate as it has always been, continued to be what it was, the same in every language, unchanged by who was doing it, as old as anything that has ever counted anything at all. And somewhere in the long record of everything that had ever happened in this part of the galaxy, in a section of the archive that was 42,000 years deep, and had just, for the first time, admitted it did not know where its own floor was, a new entry waited to be written. Not by the hegemony, not by the conclave, by whatever came next, whatever chose to come next. Choosing, after all, being the whole point.